The sound echoed through the pine trees, sharp, desperate, and human. Eleanor Ward had come to the Black Hills to escape the ghosts of her past, to start fresh, far from the life she had left behind. But nothing could have prepared her for the scream that would change her destiny. A boy, no more than 10, bloodied and terrified, trapped under the claws of a mountain lion. She had no choice. In a single moment, Ellie's life would pivot, and the consequences would be more than she could ever imagine. She didn't just save a child, she unknowingly changed the course of her fate. But what happened next? The answer is a promise made by a tribe of warriors, a vow that would bind her to them in a way no one could have foreseen. Watch till the end to discover how one simple act of courage turned a woman with no family into someone the entire Lakota tribe called blood. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the powerful story of how Eleanor Ward became more than a settler. She became family. Eleanor Ward had come to the Black Hills for one reason only: to disappear. The East had become too small for her, too full of memories of a husband who'd left her nothing but his debts and a reputation worn thin by his own vices. She had inherited a small sum when her father died, and she had enough sense to know that the life she'd known in Philadelphia would never take her back. So, with only a single trunk, a rifle, and her father's old saddle, she made her way west. The foothills of the Black Hills felt like the perfect place to bury her past. It was rugged, remote, and quiet, far from the chatter of the world and far from the expectations of others. She settled on a small patch of land, near a thin stream and surrounded by pines. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive. Ellie knew how to shoot, how to set traps, and how to keep her thoughts to herself. She learned the land quickly, though it never quite felt like it belonged to her. She was just passing through, a woman on the fringes of the world, trying to carve out a space where she could exist without being reminded of what she'd lost. Her small cabin was plain and simple, its walls built with her own hands. She didn't mind the hard work. It kept her from thinking too much about the life she had left behind. She worked by day and read by firelight at night, her only companions the wind and the animals that called the hills home. She found peace in the solitude, in the quiet rhythm of survival. But peace, it seemed, was something that could only last so long in the West. The first scream came just past dawn, a sharp and piercing cry that echoed across the valley. Ellie stood at the edge of her small porch, her hand still resting on the doorframe, listening to the unnatural sound. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the chirp of an animal in distress. It was human, and it was desperate. Without a second thought, she grabbed her rifle, pushed open the door, and started running toward the ravine. The ground was still damp from the morning's frost, and the cold air bit at her skin as she sprinted through the thick underbrush, pushing branches aside. The sound of the scream echoed in her ears, growing fainter but no less urgent. Ellie's heart raced as she followed the sound, her boots crunching against the dirt and fallen leaves. She pushed harder, her breath coming faster, until she saw him. A small boy, no older than 10, was crouched on the ground, his arms lifted. In a futile attempt to protect himself from the mountain lion that stood poised above him, its eyes glinting with hunger. Ellie froze for a heartbeat, the world narrowing down to that single moment. The boy's face was pale, his mouth open in a silent scream, his wide eyes full of terror. The lion was close now, its teeth bared, waiting for the right moment to strike. There was no time for fear. Ellie raised her rifle, aiming carefully, her finger tightening around the trigger. The lion's ears flicked back, its muscles coiling like a spring. One shot. The bullet struck the animal with a crack. The lion staggered, confused, before it collapsed in a heap on the ground. Ellie didn't wait to see it die. She dropped to her knees beside the boy, who was still trembling, his face ashen. "Hey, it's okay," Ellie said softly, her voice low and calm, despite the chaos of the moment. She moved quickly, pulling him into her arms. His body was light, fragile, and he felt as though he weighed nothing at all. The boy's eyes fluttered, and then his weight sagged against her. She could feel his shallow breaths, and for a moment she wondered if he was even still conscious. Without thinking, she stood and gathered him into her arms, carrying him away from the danger. She didn't know where he came from or who he was, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that he was alive, and she had to get him home. The journey back to her cabin felt like an eternity. The boy was limp in her arms, his fever rising with every step she took. She could feel his body burning against her, and his breathing was shallow, ragged. His lips were cracked, and his skin had already begun to take on an unhealthy pallor. Ellie's heart clenched with worry. She had no way of knowing who this child was or how he ended up in the woods alone, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let him die. She made it back to her cabin and laid him on the bed, pulling the thin blanket over him. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound on his arm and trying to ease his fever. His breath came in shallow gasps, his eyelids fluttering as he stirred, but he didn't speak. He didn't have the strength. Ellie stayed with him through the night, sitting by his side and watching as the fever took its toll. The hours passed slowly, but eventually the boy's breathing steadied. Ellie, exhausted and still uneasy, didn't let herself rest. She kept vigil. At dawn he was still alive. His breathing had deepened, and his fever was down, though his body was still weak. She watched him for a moment, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? Where did he come from? And then, just as the first light broke through the trees, she heard it. The sound of hooves in the distance. A group of riders. Ellie's hand went instinctively to her rifle, her heart hammering in her chest. The riders appeared through the trees, their horses snorting and kicking up dust. They didn't come at a gallop, but rather at a steady, deliberate pace. At the front of the group was a tall man, his dark eyes fixed on her cabin. He wore the clothes of a Lakota warrior, fur and leather, adorned with beads and feathers. As he dismounted, the other riders followed suit, circling her cabin as if waiting for something to happen. The man at the front approached her door, his step steady and sure. He stopped just before it, kneeling slowly in the dirt. "You saved my son," he said, his voice deep, but not angry. "You didn't have to. That makes you blood now, and blood is never left behind." Ellie stood there, stunned. The boy she had carried was the son of this man, a tribal leader, and now, somehow, she had become part of something much bigger than herself. The man rose, his gaze still steady, his face unreadable. "We are here because of him," he said simply. Ellie didn't know what to say, only that one act of courage had bound her to these people forever. And, from that moment on, she wasn't just a settler on the edge of the Black Hills, she was family. The sun rose high over the Black Hills, casting long shadows through the pine trees that surrounded Ellie's cabin. The riders remained outside for hours, watching over her, as if waiting for something more to unfold. Ellie, however, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not just by these strangers, but by something much deeper, something ancient, embedded in the land itself. The Lakota people, she had heard, had a connection to the earth, to the spirit of the mountains. But now she wasn't just an observer from afar. She was a part of it. She had seen them from a distance before, men like the one who stood before her now, strong and silent, with a presence that commanded respect. She had lived quietly, out of sight, but she'd heard their stories, their legends. The Lakota were known to be fierce, to honor their traditions and their land above all else. She had never imagined that they would stand on her doorstep, that she would be anything more than a shadow in their world. The man, Wicasa, as he had introduced himself, remained steady, his eyes locked on hers. His face was stern, but there was something in his gaze that softened as he looked at the boy, still lying in her bed. "I must thank you," Wicasa said, his deep voice heavy with sincerity. "You did what none of our own could. My son is alive because of you." Ellie nodded, unsure of what else to say. The weight of the moment pressed on her. and she felt, small under the intensity of his words, the boy, his son, was recovering slowly, but he hadn't spoken a word since the moment she brought him in. She didn't know how to explain her actions to Wicasa, to these men. How could she? She hadn't thought. She had just acted. But Wicasa seemed to understand. He didn't need her words. "I can't take back what you've lost," he continued, his voice quiet now, almost reverent. "But I can offer you something in return. You have saved my son. That is enough to make you family." Ellie swallowed hard. Family. The word hung in the air like a promise, but also a burden. She had come here to escape everything, her past, her grief, the people who had judged her. And now she had become part of something that could not be undone. She had no idea what this meant, what kind of life she had just invited into hers. Wicasa gestured for the other riders to gather around. "We will protect you, as we would our own," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a leader's command. "No harm will come to you as long as you are here. The Lakota will watch over you." Ellie felt her throat tighten, her mind racing. How could she accept this? How could she live in a world where she wasn't alone? The idea of dependence, of being tied to something larger than herself, was both foreign and frightening. But she also knew this. She wasn't just a widow anymore, not just a woman who had buried her husband and fled to the hills. She had saved a life, and that act had changed everything. The riders stayed through the afternoon, speaking quietly among themselves in their own tongue. They didn't intrude on her space, but made their presence known, a quiet reminder that her life was no longer her own to control. As the sun began to set, the boy stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and his body shifted slightly under the blanket. Ellie stood beside him, watching his slow, labored breaths. "His name is Wicasa," the man said, his voice close behind her. Ellie looked up at him. "Wicasa," she repeated, unsure of its meaning. "It means wise one," Wicasa explained. "He is destined for great things. His father is the leader of our people. His blood is strong." Ellie nodded, not sure if she believed in destiny or not, but the name seemed to fit the boy in some way. There was a quiet strength in him, even as he lay there weak and feverish. She had seen it in his eyes when she first found him. There was something unspoken in the way he looked at her, as though he knew something she didn't. The night passed slowly, with Ellie keeping watch over him, and by morning his fever had broken. He stirred again, his eyes flickering open, and for the first time since she had found him, he spoke. "Why?" His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was enough to send a rush of emotion through her chest. Ellie leaned closer to him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Why what?" she asked, her voice soft. "Why didn't you let me die?" The question hit her harder than she had expected. She had saved him, yes, but she hadn't thought much beyond that. She hadn't realized that, for him, death had been the easier option. It was a harsh truth. For some, survival was the hardest thing to bear. She exhaled slowly, finding her words. "Because you're worth saving," she said, her voice low but steady. "Because you deserve to live." The boy's eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was something else in them now, something different than the fear he had shown before. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the realization that he wasn't alone anymore. But before he could say anything more, the sound of hooves reached her ears. Ellie looked up, and there, standing in the doorway of her cabin, was Wicasa, his eyes fixed on his son. "It's time," he said softly, his voice filled with both pride and sorrow. Ellie stood quickly, the weight of the moment pressing in on her chest. She didn't want to let go of this boy, not yet, but she knew she had no say in the matter. He was theirs now, not just hers. Wicasa knelt beside the bed, his hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder. "You will be with us now. You will be trained, taught. You will grow strong." The boy didn't speak. His gaze lingered on Ellie, still uncertain, still trying to understand. Wicasa turned to her, his face unreadable. "You saved him. Now you are one of us." And with that, the Lakota began to leave, their silent figures fading into the distance, but not before one final glance back toward Ellie. For the first time since she had arrived in the Black Hills, she felt something shift deep within her. A connection, a bond, one that tied her to this land and its people forever. The circle had closed. Ellie was no longer a woman alone in the wilderness. She was part of something much greater than herself. And as the riders disappeared into the trees, she realized the true weight of what she had done. She had saved a boy, and in turn, she had saved herself. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. Eleanor Ward spent her time in a haze, unsure of what her new life meant, yet oddly comforted by the presence of the Lakota people. They were a distant, silent force in her life now. She couldn't escape them. They were as much a part of the land as the pines and the streams, as inevitable as the changing seasons. Wicasa had kept his promise. The boy, Wicasa Jr., was growing stronger each day. His fever had broken, and he was eating. Now, though he was still quiet, his large brown eyes filled with more questions than answers. He spent his days resting and learning. Wicasa took him aside for brief lessons, imparting to him the wisdom of his tribe. The boy's stoic nature seemed to mirror his father's, his every movement purposeful, measured. Ellie didn't know what to make of it. It had been a week since the riders left her cabin, and in that time she had tried to give the boy the space he needed to recover. She cared for him, of course. After all, she had saved him, but her connection to him felt like a fragile thing, still being forged in the fires of uncertainty. One morning, as the sun broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground, Ellie heard the familiar sound of hooves. It was still early, and she hadn't expected anyone, not after the tribe had left. She stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the bright light, and saw him, Wicasa. He was alone, his horse steady beneath him, as he rode up to her. "Cabin!" His gaze was unwavering as he dismounted, his movements smooth and practiced. He stood there for a moment, silent, before speaking. "The boy is healing well," he said, his voice deep and steady. "But I can't keep him here forever. He must return to the tribe, to his people." Ellie's heart tightened. There it was, the inevitable moment she had known was coming. She had known from the moment she'd held him in her arms that he wasn't hers to keep. He was Lakota, not just a child she had saved, but... She hesitated, the words coming slowly. "I promised I'd keep him safe. I thought you meant..." She faltered, unsure of what exactly she had thought. Wicasa nodded, his expression softening. "For the first time since they had met, you did keep him safe, and because of that, you are part of us. But he is not meant to stay here. His place is with his people, with his family." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost tender. "The Lakota do not forget acts of kindness. You have shown him what it means to be saved. Now he must learn what it means to be strong." Ellie looked down at the ground, her mind racing. She didn't want to let go. There was a part of her, an old, buried part, that wanted to keep him with her, to keep the connection she had formed. But she knew better. Wicasa stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "You will always have a place with us," he said, "not just because of the boy, but because you saved him. You have made an ally of the Lakota." Ellie's eyes lifted to meet his, and for a brief moment she saw a flicker of something in his gaze. Respect, maybe, or acknowledgement. But then it was gone, replaced by the calm resolve that marked him. "I can't take him back," she said softly, the words more to herself than to him. "I've never been a mother. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Wicasa's lips curved slightly. "Then you will learn, as all mothers do. The boy will show you the way." She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said nothing, instead turning her eyes to the boy who had become so much more to her than a stranger in the woods. He was standing in the doorway, his small frame outlined by the soft light of the morning. His gaze was fixed on her, and for the first time since she'd found him, he wasn't avoiding her eyes. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond that tied them together. She could feel the weight of his stare, the question still lingering in his eyes. He had no answers, no comfort to offer her. He was still a child, still learning what it meant to be alive. "You'll be fine," Wicasa said, his voice gentle. "Go with him, Wicasa. Learn what you must." The boy nodded, his movements slow, but deliberate. He turned, heading toward his father, and without a word, he mounted the horse beside him. Ellie stood frozen for a moment, watching them, watching him. She wanted to say something, to call him back, but she knew better. He was a Lakota child, destined for a life that she could never be a part of. "Goodbye, little one," she whispered, barely audible, and with that, the boy was gone. She felt a strange emptiness as they rode away, disappearing into the trees, their silhouettes fading into the mist. It wasn't a loss she could articulate, it wasn't something she could explain, but she felt it, deep in her bones, a quiet ache that tugged at her heart. For the first time since she'd come to the Black Hills, Ellie felt truly alone. The days that followed were the quietest Ellie had ever known. The sound of the boy's laughter, the soft shuffle of his feet as he moved around the cabin, it was all gone. And with it, the feeling that she was part of something larger. The silence left her unmoored, like a boat adrift in open water, unsure of which direction to head. For days, Ellie did little more than go through the motions. She tended to the small vegetable garden she'd started when she first arrived, mended her clothing, and cleaned her cabin. There was no rush to do anything. She could take her time now, she had no obligations, and yet there was a hollowness she couldn't shake. In the evenings, when the sun sank low in the sky, Ellie would sit on her porch, staring at the horizon. She could hear the wind moving through the pines, the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush, and the distant sound of the river cutting through the valley below. But it wasn't the same. She wasn't sure if it was the boy she missed or the sense of purpose he had given her. For the first time since she'd arrived in the Black Hills, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She had been needed. She had mattered. The emptiness gnawed at her, a constant companion. Then, one evening, as the light began to fade and the air grew colder, Ellie heard the familiar sound of hooves again. This time, it wasn't just the wind or the distant cry of a bird. The sound was real close, and it was coming toward her cabin. Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected anyone, certainly not after Wicasa had taken the boy. She stood slowly, a quiet tension moving through her limbs. She had gotten used to the solitude, had come to appreciate it. She wasn't ready for company, not yet. But then the horse appeared, stepping into the fading light, its rider silhouetted against the setting sun. It was Wicasa. He was alone, his expression unreadable as always. The horse moved slowly as it approached, its hooves echoing on the dirt path. Wicasa dismounted with the ease of someone who had lived in the saddle for a lifetime. His eyes, however, were sharp as he studied her. "I've come to see you," he said, his voice deep and steady. "The boy is well. His training has begun." Ellie nodded, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't seen him since he had taken his son and left. She had wondered if she would ever see him again, if she would ever truly understand the place she had in their world. "How is he?" Ellie asked, her voice quiet, filled with a tenderness she hadn't realized she still felt. Wicasa's gaze softened slightly, though his face remained as stoic as ever. "He is strong, he is learning, but I did not come to speak of him." Ellie's brow furrowed, her chest tightening as she waited for him to continue. Wicasa stepped forward, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "I came to speak of you," he said, "and of the promise I made." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The promise. She had thought of little else since he had left with his son. "You saved my son's life," Wicasa said, his voice now quieter as if the weight of his words was finally sinking in. "That is no small thing." Ellie shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what he was getting at. "You've already done more for me than I could ever ask for." Wicasa shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "You misunderstand. I am not here to thank you. I am here because I owe you a debt that cannot be repaid in words alone." Ellie's heart began to race. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she didn't like the heaviness in his tone. What could he want from her now? She had saved his son, but she had never expected anything in return. Wicasa took a step closer, his hand resting briefly on the railing of her porch. "You are not just a settler, you are family now, and because of that, I offer you the protection of my people." Ellie opened her mouth to protest, but he raised a hand to silence her. "You are part of us now," he said. "That means something to us. We do not take it lightly, and there are those who would harm you for the kindness you have shown." Ellie's heart thudded in her chest. "Who would harm me?" Wicasa's eyes darkened, and for the first time she saw something more than stoic calm in his face. There was anger there, something fierce and untamed, like a storm just below the surface. There are men, settlers and others, who see you as a threat. They will not forget the life you have given to my son. They will not forget that you stand. With the Lakota, Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? What are they planning?" Wicasa was silent for a moment, his gaze hardening. "They will come for you soon. They will try to drive you off this land just as they have driven others before you. But you will not be alone. We will stand with you." Ellie's mind spun. She had expected many things when she had come west, but this was something different. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive anymore. She was something more, something that others would fight to control, to crush. "I can't fight them," Ellie said, her voice a whisper. I'm not like you." Wicasa looked at her steadily. "You do not need to fight. You only need to stand. The Lakota will fight for you." Ellie felt a strange mix of fear and gratitude. Fear for what was coming, and gratitude for the protection he offered. She wasn't sure if she could accept it, but she didn't have much choice. "I don't want trouble," she said quietly. "I just want to live in peace." Wicasa's lips twitched slightly, though it wasn't a smile. "The West does not offer peace, but we offer strength, and that is something you will need." With that he turned and mounted his horse. Before he left, he paused and looked back at her. "Remember this, Ellie Ward, you are not alone. Not any more." The words lingered long after he was gone, hanging in the air like a promise. Ellie stood on her porch, her hands resting on the railing, staring into the distance. For the first time since arriving in the Black Hills, she wasn't just surviving. She was part of something that was much bigger than herself. And as she gazed out at the land before her, she realized the truth. Survival wasn't just about the land. It was about the people who watched over you, and now she had people. The question was, how long would the peace last? The wind came from the east that morning, howling through the trees like a hungry animal. Ellie stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching the clouds gather over the Black Hills. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of change. She had known it was coming, but the realization hit her with full force when she spotted the smoke rising in the distance. It was faint at first, just a thin thread against the sky. But as the minutes passed, it grew darker, thicker. Something was burning. Her heart clenched. She didn't need to guess what it was. She grabbed her rifle, her movements automatic now, her instincts sharper than they'd been when she first arrived. The gun had become an extension of herself over the months, her means of survival, her only tool to ward off the harshness of the world. Ellie was no fool. She knew that when Wicasa had warned her, it wasn't just an idle threat. The settlers, those who had watched from a distance, were always waiting for an opportunity to take what didn't belong to them. They were always looking for a reason, to reclaim the land that the Lakota called their own. This time, though, the reason was clear. Ellie herself. She hesitated, looking back at her cabin, at the life she had begun to build. It was all so fragile, so fleeting. One act of courage had brought her into this world of danger, and now, it seemed, she was paying the price. Without another thought, she set off toward the smoke, her legs moving faster than her mind. The path she took was familiar, one she had walked countless times, but this time there was a sense of urgency, of dread, that made every step feel like it could be her last. She reached the clearing where the fire was burning, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The settlement that lay before her was already in flames. The wind had whipped the fire out of control, sending thick clouds of smoke into the sky, choking the land with its fury. The cabins were collapsing, their wooden frames crumbling under the heat. A group of men stood nearby laughing, shouting, as they tossed burning logs into the wreckage, fanning the flames as if they were watching some kind of twisted spectacle. Ellie's stomach churned. These were the men Wicasa had warned her about, those who would tear down the lives of others in their quest to claim more for themselves. They weren't just burning homes, they were making a statement, a warning. She crouched low, watching. Them, her hand gripping the rifle tightly. Her mind raced. She had to act. She couldn't let them destroy everything, but she couldn't fight all of them, not by herself. Her eyes darted to the trees behind her, where she knew Wicasa and his people had set up camp. There were warriors nearby, but they were waiting for the right moment to strike. The Lakota had taught her one thing in the months since she had met them: patience. They didn't rush into battle. They waited for the moment when they had the upper hand. Ellie had never been a patient woman, but now, with the fire roaring before her and the danger closing in, she understood the value of holding back, of waiting for the right moment to make her move. She took a deep breath, watching the men in the clearing. There were only a few of them, 3, maybe 4, and they were too focused on the fire to notice her watching. This was her chance. Quietly, she rose to her feet, slipping around the edge of the clearing to get closer. Her movements were swift, calculated. She had to get close enough to make a difference, but not so close that they would see her. She wasn't ready for a fight. Not yet, but she would be. Her mind flashed back to the first time she had fired a shot in the Black Hills, the rush of adrenaline as she had taken down the mountain line, the way her body had reacted without thought. This was no different. She wasn't just a woman in a cabin anymore. She was part of something bigger, a movement, a force that was bigger than herself. And she wasn't going to let these men tear it all down. She took aim at the nearest man, the one who seemed to be directing the others. His face twisted in a grin as he shoved a burning log onto a pile of rubble. One shot. Ellie steadied herself, her breath slowing as she squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked in her hands, and the man dropped to the ground without a sound. Chaos erupted immediately. The other men shouted in alarm, looking around for the source of the shot. But Ellie had already moved, sliding behind a large boulder that stood just outside the clearing. She couldn't risk giving away her position. She had to be smart about this. The men scrambled, calling to each other, their voices rising in panic. They didn't know who had fired or where the shot had come from, but Ellie knew her window was closing. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement in the trees. A figure appeared, darting through the shadows with the speed and grace of a predator. Wicasa. He was flanked by several Lakota warriors, all moving with the same precision and calm that Ellie had come to admire. They had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, with the first man down, they were moving in. Ellie didn't wait for them to reach the clearing. She rose, her rifle already trained on the next target. Another shot rang out, and one of the remaining men fell, his body crumpling to the dirt. The others panicked, running for cover. But it was too late. The Lakota were already on them, their movements swift and brutal. Wicasa's voice rang out, commanding his men to act, to protect their land, their people. In moments, it was over. The fire was still burning, but the men who had started it lay dead or fleeing into the wilderness, defeated by the Lakota warriors who had come to protect what was theirs. Ellie stood there, her breath coming fast, her hands trembling from the bee, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The smoke still hung thick in the air, the smell of burning wood and scorched earth stinging her nose. But the battle was over. For now. Wicasa approached her, his expression as unreadable as ever. But his eyes held something more: gratitude, respect, maybe even pride. "You did well," he said simply. Ellie nodded, her heart still racing. "I didn't do it alone." Wicasa's gaze softened slightly. "No, you didn't." And with that, he turned, signaling his warriors to begin extinguishing the fire before it could spread too far. Ellie watched him for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. This was her new life, one of survival, of strength, and most of all, of loyalty. She wasn't just a settler anymore. She was part of something far more dangerous and far more powerful than she had ever imagined, and now she had to learn how to live with that power. The days after the fire passed slowly, but the damage it had caused lingered like the smoke in the air. Ellie spent her time helping the Lakota warriors extinguish the flames, digging through the charred remains of the cabins that had once stood. Proud in the valley. The fire had taken much, but it had failed to break the spirit of the land, or the people who had come to protect it. The settlers who had attacked were gone now, scattered like the ashes of their homes, but Ellie couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her bones. She had heard the whispers before, the rumors of settlers who would do anything to take the land, anything to drive the Lakota off their rightful territories. She had thought she was safe, living far from town, far from the reach of those who didn't understand. But she had been wrong, and now she was part of something larger, a conflict she hadn't chosen, but one that she couldn't walk away from. The Lakota had claimed her as one of their own. They had bound themselves to her, and she to them. There was no turning back, not now. The sun set each night, painting the sky with colors Ellie had never seen before, deep purples and fiery oranges, streaks of red that bled into the horizon like blood on the earth. The land, vast and unyielding, stretched before her, and she felt the weight of it in her chest. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also dangerous. It had its own rules, its own heartbeats, and it didn't care for the weak or the naive. Ellie sat by the fire that evening, her legs stretched out in front of her, watching the flames dance as the Lakota warriors gathered around her. Wicasa was there too, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he stared into the flames. There was a quietness in him, a contemplation that Ellie had come to respect. "You did well today," he said quietly, his voice deep and steady as always. Ellie didn't look up. "I'm not sure I did. I fired the first shot, but it wasn't enough to stop them. The Lakota did the rest." Wicasa chuckled softly, a low rumble in his throat. "You misunderstand. Your shot was the beginning. The moment they knew someone was watching, someone was fighting back, they were already defeated. You gave us the opening we needed. You reminded them that we do not stand alone." Ellie shifted uncomfortably. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't even feel like a fighter. She had done what she had to do, but it was far from the kind of life she'd imagined when she first left the East. She was in the middle of something, much bigger now, a story that was still unfolding, and one she hadn't yet decided if she was ready to be a part of. Wicasa, noticing her silence, leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You're still unsure of where you belong, aren't you?" His words were not accusatory, but understanding, as if he had seen it in her from the very beginning. Ellie nodded. "I didn't come out here to be part of anything but myself. I wanted to be alone, to forget." "You did forget," he replied, his voice softer now, as if he were speaking to her and to the world that had shaped her. "But you cannot undo what is already done. You cannot unsee what you have seen, and you cannot unhear what you have heard. You saved my son, and in doing so, you saved all of us." Ellie was silent for a long time. The fire crackled and popped. between them, but her thoughts were far from it. She had saved a child. She had saved a boy who was now becoming a warrior in his own right. She had become something to the Lakota, something she never asked to be. She had become part of the land's heartbeat. She had become a protector, and that, more than anything, scared her. "You do not have to fight like us," Wicasa continued, sensing her hesitation, "but you must stand. That is all." Ellie turned to face him, her voice quiet. "Stand for what?" He looked at her with steady eyes, the weight of his years in the Black Hills showing in the lines of his face. "Stand for what is right. Stand for the people who fight for what is theirs. Stand for the boy you saved. He will never forget you, Ellie. Neither will the Lakota. Once you are family, you are always family." She could feel the weight of his words in her chest, like a drumbeat, slow and steady. He wasn't just speaking of loyalty, he was speaking of responsibility, and that, more than anything, was what Ellie had never been prepared for. Her heart pounded as the fire crackled again, sending sparks up into the night sky. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, more to herself than to Wicasa. "You already have," he said softly, the corner of his lips lifting slightly. "You've done it without even knowing." Ellie stared into the fire, the light flickering. In her eyes, as she felt the weight of his words, she had done it. She had saved a life, yes, but she had also stepped into a world that was far more dangerous than she had ever realized. Her past, her life before the Black Hills, felt like a distant memory, like a dream that she could never quite grasp again. But this was real, and it was becoming more real with every passing day. Wicasa stood, his movement smooth and purposeful, like the wind that moved through the pines. He looked down at her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "Rest, Ellie. Tomorrow will be a new day. There is more to do, and we will do it together." As he walked away, Ellie stayed by the fire, watching the flames dance, her thoughts as restless as the embers that rose into the night sky. She didn't know what the next day would bring. She didn't know if she was ready for what was to come. But one thing was clear, she couldn't go back. She was here now, part of something far larger than herself, something that was shaping her, that was changing her in ways she couldn't understand yet. And for the first time, Ellie knew that she would stand, not just for the Lakota, but for herself. Because the West wasn't just about surviving, it was about standing tall, and in that moment, Ellie Ward understood what it meant to truly stand. The morning after the fire was eerily still. Ellie woke early, her body stiff from the restless night spent beside the fire. She had barely slept, her mind churning with thoughts of what had happened and what was yet to come. The wind had died down, leaving the land feeling almost too quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. She made her way out of the cabin, the cold air biting at her skin, the early light soft against the horizon. The Black Hills stretched before her, beautiful and untamed, yet filled with a danger she had only begun to understand. The fire had left its mark, but the land was resilient. The Lakota were resilient. Ellie had always been a woman who believed in self-reliance, in the quiet strength that came from doing things for herself. But in the days since the attack, she had learned something new. She had learned that survival was not just about being alone. It was about connection, about knowing when to stand on your own and when to stand with others. She had stood with the Lakota, and they had stood with her. But now, as the smoke from the fire cleared, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The threat wasn't over. There were still those who would try to take this land from the Lakota, from her. And Ellie had to decide if she was ready to fight for it. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Wicasa appeared on horseback, riding slowly toward her cabin. His silhouette was framed by the rising light, a figure of strength and purpose. His presence was always commanding, but this morning there was a weight in his eyes that Ellie hadn't seen before. He dismounted and walked toward her, his steps purposeful, but measured. When he reached her, He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied her, as if weighing something unspoken between them. "Today, you will come with me," Mikasa said finally, his voice low and steady. Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Where are we going?" "To the council," he replied simply. "There are things that need to be said, things that must be decided." She nodded slowly, her mind already working through the possibilities. She had seen the Lakota warriors in their quiet deliberations before, but this was different. This was something more important. Mikasa had never spoken of the council before, and she hadn't asked. It wasn't her place to question, but today, it seemed, that was about to change. Together, they walked to the edge of the land where the Lakota had set up camp, a circle of tents, some with smoke rising from their chimneys, others still packed with the remnants of the attack. The warriors moved in silence, their eyes sharp, their movements deliberate. As they approached the center of the camp, the other leaders of the tribe stood waiting. There were 4 of them, all men, though their age and experience were reflected in the quiet strength they carried with them. Mikasa spoke to them in their native tongue, the words flowing with a rhythm that Ellie didn't fully understand, but could feel deep in her chest. The conversation was brief, but the tension in the air was thick. Ellie didn't know exactly what was being said, but she could hear the urgency in their voices, the need for action. After a few moments, one of the older men nodded and motioned for Ellie to step forward. Mikasa placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "This is the council of the Lakota," he said. "They speak for the people, and now they will speak for you." Ellie felt a cold knot form in her stomach, her nerves stretching tight. She had never been one to stand before a group and be judged, especially not by people whose world she had only recently entered. The man who had summoned her, the eldest of the council, his face lined with age and wisdom, looked at her with eyes that seemed to see right through her. "You are the one who saved the boy," he said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of years. "You are the one who brought the wrath of the settlers to our land." Ellie nodded, trying to steady her breath, though her heart raced. "I did what was right," she replied quietly. "I saved him because it was the only thing I could do," the council murmured, their faces unreadable. Mikasa stepped forward, speaking in the same quiet, authoritative tone that Ellie had come to know. "The settlers have attacked us before, but never with such force. The boy's survival, his connection to the Lakota, has brought us both danger and opportunity." The elder nodded, his eyes never leaving Ellie. "You saved his life, and in doing so, you have made yourself part of this land. You are no longer just a settler. You are a sister." The words hung in the air, and Ellie felt the weight of them, the meaning sinking deep into her bones. She had never asked for this, never expected it, but it was happening nonetheless. "Do you understand what that means?" the elder asked, his voice low and measured. Ellie looked at the faces around her, each one of them strong, each one of them resolute. These were the people who had stood together for generations, who had fought for the land, for their survival. And now they were offering her the same strength. They were offering her something that went beyond survival. She wasn't sure if she understood all the implications of their words, but she knew this much. She couldn't walk away now. Not when the stakes were this high. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I understand." The elder studied her for a long moment, as if seeing something in her that others might have missed. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, and the council dispersed, their discussions moving to quieter corners of the camp. Mikasa stayed beside her, his presence solid and unyielding. "You are now a part of this fight, Ellie," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "The settlers will not stop until they have taken everything from us, from you, but you will not face them alone." Ellie nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. This was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a matter of standing with the Lakota, standing for something greater than herself. And for the first time, Ellie Ward felt the spark of something within her, something fierce, something unbreakable. She was ready. The air was thick with tension as the days moved on, the quiet after the storm only masking the unrest brewing beneath the surface. Ellie had spent the past few days with the Lakota, learning their ways, their customs. She wasn't yet fully part of their world, but she was getting closer. She had to be. There was no going back. The sun hung low in the sky when Wicasa approached her again, this time with an urgency she hadn't seen before. His face was tight with resolve, the usually calm and steady man now showing the strain of something weighing heavily on him. "We leave at dawn," he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. "Leave? Where are we going?" "To confront the settlers. They are gathering forces near the ridge. They will come soon, and we cannot wait any longer." Ellie's breath caught in her chest. She had known this moment was coming, but knowing didn't. Make it easier. She wasn't a warrior. She had never fought for anything other than survival. But now she had no choice. This wasn't just a matter of standing by the Lakota. This was a matter of standing for everything she had come to care for. She looked at Wicasa, his dark eyes meeting hers, with a calmness that only seemed to magnify the storm inside her. He saw her hesitation. "You are ready, Ellie. You do not have to fight with a sword or a rifle, but you must stand with us. We cannot win if we do not stand together." Ellie swallowed hard, looking out at the camp. The warriors were already preparing. The women, the children, they were all ready to move. The community was a machine, moving with quiet precision, as if this was just another day in their lives. But for Ellie, this was not another day. It was a reckoning. "I will stand with you," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Wicasa's face softened, the first sign of warmth breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "Good, let us go." The ride to the ridge was long, the land beneath them sprawling out in a sea of pines and valleys. The Lakota moved with the speed and grace of those who had lived in the wilderness their entire lives. They were not hurried, but there was no doubt they were on a mission. Ellie, though not as practiced, kept pace. She had learned to ride well enough over the past months, but it wasn't the skill of riding that weighed on her, it was the knowledge of what was ahead. They reached the ridge just as the sun began to sink beneath the horizon, casting the land in a soft orange glow. From their vantage point, Ellie could see the settlers' camp in the distance, the campfires flickering like distant stars. The men had gathered, just as Wicasa had warned, and there were more than she had expected, a small knot twisted in her stomach as she surveyed the scene. The settlers were organized, but they were not as disciplined as the Lakota. They were unprepared for the fierce unity that the Lakota had forged through generations of survival. Wicasa, standing beside her, followed her gaze. "They believe they can take the land. They believe they can push us out." Ellie turned to him, her voice low. "Will they?" "No," he said firmly. "We will make them understand that this land is ours, and we will not give it up." Ellie nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. There was no going back now. She had already chosen her side. But she still didn't know what that truly meant. As the warriors prepared for the night ahead, Ellie made her way to the fire, where the women were gathered. They were silent, their faces set in expressions of quiet strength. They didn't need to speak. They understood the gravity of the moment as much as the men did. One of the women, a young mother with 2 small children, caught her eye and offered a small smile. Ellie smiled back, though it felt strained. She didn't know how she could be part of something like this, something that felt like it could tear apart everything she had come to care for. But this was the reality now. There was no choice. They were fighting for their way of life, for their families, for the future. Wicasa approached her again, his expression more serious than it had been. "We will move out soon. I will lead the warriors to meet them. But we will not strike until we are sure of victory. You will remain with the women and children. They need your strength." Ellie hesitated, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had placed on her. She had never thought of herself as someone who could give strength to others. She had spent her whole life trying to protect herself, but here now, that was no longer enough. "I will stay," she said, her voice steady. Wicasa gave her a curt nod before he mounted his horse. "Stay close. The danger is real." As he disappeared into the darkness with the rest of the warriors, Ellie turned her gaze back to the settlers' camp. The firelight flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the valley. The air was thick with anticipation. The sound of horses moving in the distance, the crackling of the fire. And somewhere in the woods, the first signs of battle would begin. Ellie didn't know what the outcome would be. She didn't know if she was truly ready for this fight, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone. The night stretched on, an unsettling calm before the storm. Ellie sat with the women, watching the darkness creep across the ridge, their faces glowing faintly in the firelight. They sat close together, their backs straight, their eyes steady. There was no fear here, only determination. Ellie, though, couldn't still the tremor in her bones. She had never been in a battle. She had never stood at the edge of something that could shatter her world in an instant. But this night, she was part of something much larger than herself, a fight for survival, for family, for home. The Lakota moved with silent precision. Wicasa had given clear instructions. The warriors would remain hidden until the last possible moment, letting the settlers believe they were safe, unaware of the approaching force. It was a tactic born of patience and understanding of the land. The hours passed, Ellie's thoughts drifted, pulled between the fear of what was to come and the overwhelming sense of responsibility. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She wasn't just a woman living on the fringe. She was part of this fight. She was part of the land, part of the Lakota, and that meant standing beside them, whatever the cost. The air grew colder as the night wore on, the wind picking up, rustling the trees in the distance. A lone owl called out, its hoot cutting through the silence. Ellie pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the night settle in her chest. And then, just as the moon began to rise, the sound came. At first, it was faint, the soft crunch of boots on dry ground. But it grew louder, closer, the unmistakable sound of men moving through the woods. The settlers were coming. Their advance had begun. Wicasa's voice broke through the quiet, steady, and commanding. "It is time." Ellie's heart skipped. She rose to her feet, the cold ground beneath her feet grounding her in the moment. The women around her stood as well, preparing to take their places. Some would tend to the children, some would keep watch. All of them were ready. But Ellie felt a sudden rush of dread. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself if things went wrong. She was just a woman in the middle of a battle she didn't fully understand. Wicasa caught her eye, his gaze piercing in the darkness. "Stay close. Trust in us." She nodded. Though the fear didn't dissipate, she wasn't sure what she was. Afraid of more, the battle, or the fact that she had already chosen to fight in it. The warriors moved out, a silent wave of strength slipping through the trees. Ellie followed them, keeping to the edge of the camp, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The fire had dimmed to a low glow, but she could still hear the sounds of the settlers in the distance. Laughter, shouting, the sound of campfires crackling. She had never felt so alive, so aware of every small noise, every shift in the wind. She felt the land beneath her feet, the weight of it, and realized just how deep her connection to it had grown. The land was alive. It was breathing. It had a pulse. And now it was waiting. The first cry of a battle horn shattered the silence, the sound sharp and sudden. It was followed by the unmistakable clash of metal, the sounds of combat rising from the valley below. The warriors had made their move. Ellie's heart thudded in her chest as she instinctively crouched lower, pressing herself against the trees. The air felt heavier now, the tension almost unbearable. She could hear the shouts of the settlers, confusion, anger, fear, as the Lakota warriors closed in. The fight was underway. Wikasa's voice came again, low and steady. "Move! Stay out of their sight. Protect the women and children." Ellie nodded, her body moving almost without thought. She had never been trained for this. She wasn't a fighter. But she could help. She could be the strength they needed. As the first waves of conflict swirled around her, Ellie kept to the shadows, moving quickly, quietly, trying to stay hidden. The warriors were swift, their attacks precise, striking at the heart of the settlers' camp. The sounds of battle filled the air, clashing swords, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, the roar of men who had never expected to meet such resistance. Ellie moved with purpose, reaching the women and children huddled in the trees. She had learned how to lead, how to protect, in the days since she'd joined the Lakota. Her hands shook as she gathered them close, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Stay low," she instructed, her words quiet but firm. "Stay hidden. The fight is not here." They obeyed without question, their faces tense, their eyes wide with the fear of what was unfolding. Ellie stayed with them, watching the battle from the shadows. She could see the warriors moving with fluidity, their presence like shadows in the night. They didn't need to rush. They had the advantage now. She could see Wikasa in the distance, his figure commanding as he moved through the chaos, a force of nature. The settlers were disoriented, panicked, their attempts at defense feeble against the fury of the Lakota. Yapom didn't take long. Within moments, the settlers' resistance crumbled, the last of them retreating into the trees, their camp a smoldering ruin in the distance. The warriors began to regroup, their quiet strength unmistakable. Ellie's heart slowed as the battle ended, the silence falling over the valley like a heavy blanket. The smoke still lingered in the air, but the sounds of fighting had stopped. The Lakota had won. Wikasa approached her, his face grim but resolute. "It is over," he said softly. "But this is only the beginning. There will be more battles. More who try to take this land from us." Ellie nodded, her eyes searching the battlefield. She had never imagined herself in the midst of such violence, but now it seemed it was all she knew. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive anymore. She was a part of this land, a part of the Lakota's fight, and she would fight with them, because there was no turning back now. Chapter 10. The aftermath of the battle was nothing like what Ellie had imagined. There was no victory cheer, no sense of triumph. The Lakota warriors moved with quiet precision, their faces calm as they tended to their wounded, gathered their fallen, and began the task of extinguishing the lingering fires. The settlers were scattered, some dead, some fled into the hills, their future uncertain, but their presence no longer a threat. Ellie stood at the edge of the ridge, her hands trembling from the aftermath of the fight. She had been part of the night, part of the defense. But now that it was over, she felt like a stranger in a world she hadn't fully understood. She had come out here to escape, to find some kind of peace. Instead, she had found violence, conflict, and a world that didn't stop turning just because she was tired of running. Wikasa appeared beside her, his gaze as unreadable as ever, though there was a quiet understanding in his eyes. "It is done," he said, his voice steady, though there was a heaviness to it. "The settlers have learned that the Lakota will not yield, but this is not over. This is only one battle." Ellie turned to him, her eyes filled with something that had been building inside her for days. Questions, doubts, fears. How long will it go on, this fighting? It never ends. He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he gazed out, at the land as if searching for something in the distance. "The land is ours," he said finally, his voice firm, unwavering. "The Lakota have fought for this land for centuries. We do not give up what is ours, no matter the cost. But peace is not something that can be forced. We fight because we must, not because we want to." Ellie felt the weight of his words, the truth that lingered in the air between them. She had been naive to think that she could come to this place and escape the world she had left behind. There was no escape here, not for anyone, not for the Lakota, not for her. The boy, she said quietly, her thoughts shifting to the child who had brought her into this fight. He's learning to be a warrior. He's growing up in this. Wikasa's gaze softened for a moment, a brief flash of something more than the stoic leader she had come to know. He is learning to protect what is his, he said. What is his to protect? And one day he will stand where I stand. Ellie nodded, a knot tightening in her throat. She couldn't imagine a boy, any boy, growing up in a world of war, of endless conflict. She had already seen too much. But the truth was, she couldn't change the world. She could only be a part of it. As the warriors continued their work, Ellie walked through the camp, her mind heavy. She had helped today. She had stood with them. But was that enough? What kind of woman was she now? What kind of life had she chosen? She looked up as she approached the women's camp, where the children were beginning to stir. The women were already organizing, making sure everything was in order for the day. There was no fear in their movements, no hesitation. They had seen this before. They were a part of this world. One of the women, the young mother who had smiled at her the night before, caught Ellie's eye. She was holding her small child, her face serene despite the chaos that had unfolded. There was strength in her, strength that Ellie had seen in every one of the Lakota women. They were unbroken, no matter what the world threw at them. You did well last night, the woman said, her voice soft but filled with an understanding that Ellie hadn't expected. Ellie hesitated, unsure of what to say. I didn't do much, She trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. I just stood with you, the woman smiled, and that is enough. Sometimes that is all we can do. Ellie felt something stir within her, a realization that had been forming since the moment she had arrived in the Black Hills. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was a part of something. She was part of a family, a people who had endured everything the world had thrown at them, and had never once yielded. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully belong here. She didn't know if she could ever truly be Lakota. But one thing was clear. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe that was enough. Later that day, as the sun began to sink beneath the horizon, the warriors gathered once more, their faces grim as they prepared for the next phase of their journey. Wikasa stood in the center, his voice low, as he addressed the men. This battle is over, he said, but it will not be the last. There will be more who come, more who seek to take what is ours. Ellie stood at the edge of the camp, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the battle was never truly over. But she had come to understand something in the silence of the night, in the fierceness of the battle, something deeper than survival. The Lakota weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for their way of life. They were fighting for their families, for their children, for their future, and as Ellie stood with them, she realized that she, too, was fighting for a place in this world, for a life that mattered, for something more than just surviving. Wikasa turned to her, his gaze steady. Are you ready, Ellie? He asked, his voice quiet, but filled with a deep sense of purpose. She met his eyes, her breath steady as she nodded. Yes, she said simply. I'm ready. And as the warriors moved into position, Ellie felt a strange calm wash over her. She wasn't just a part of this battle. She was a part of the land, a part of this fight. And in that moment, she knew that whatever came next, she would stand. She would stand with the Lakota, with the land, with the people who had become her family, and that was enough. The wind had shifted by morning, bringing with it a sharp bite to the air, a sign that winter was not far off. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the camp as the warriors prepared for the journey ahead. The night's battle had been won, but Ellie knew that the victory had come at a price, one that was far from paid in full. As the warriors packed their supplies, moving with the same quiet precision that had come to define them, Ellie found herself once again at the edge of the camp. She had become accustomed to the rhythm of life here, the preparation before the storm, the tension, the waiting. But it was never easy. The weight of each decision, each moment, pressed on her shoulders. She had done what she could during the battle, staying in the shadows with the women and children, helping where she could, but she had never fired a shot. She had never known what it felt like to stand in the middle of that chaos and take what was hers. She had watched the Lakota warriors with a mixture of awe and fear, admiring their calm, their strength. They fought because it was in their blood, in their bones. For them, it wasn't just survival, it was a way of life. But for Ellie, it was different. She was still learning, still trying to find her place in a world that had never felt like her own. Wicasa found her standing by the fire, the embers glowing in the early morning light. He approached her quietly as always, his presence filling the space between them. "It is time to go," he said, his voice low. But there was something in it today, a quiet urgency, a weight that hadn't been there before. Ellie turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Where are we going?" "To the ridge," Wicasa replied, his eyes steady. "We must claim what is ours. We must send a message." Ellie nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, something beyond the battles and the victories. "And after that?" she asked, her voice soft, but laced with something deeper. "What happens after the fighting ends?" Wicasa met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "There will be no end, Ellie. Not until the settlers understand. They will always come. They will always try to take what is not theirs." She felt a tightness in her chest at his words. It was true. There was no peace in this land, at least not the kind she had imagined. She had hoped for quiet, for solitude, but she had found none of that. Instead, she had found war, survival, and a fight for something that seemed too big to grasp. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had chosen this path, and though it had come with its share of fear and doubt, Ellie knew she couldn't walk away. She was part of this now, part of the Lakota, part of their fight, part of their future. "I'm ready," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure if she was ready for what was to come. But there was no turning back now. Wicasa studied her for a moment longer before he gave a slight nod. "Come, we leave now." The journey to the ridge was swift, the warriors moving in their usual formation, their horses steady beneath them. The land was vast, the hills stretching out before them like an endless sea of pines and brush. Ellie rode with the women and children, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. Wicasa led the group, his face set in stone as he guided the warriors to their destination. The Lakota were prepared. Ellie could see it in the way they moved, the way they were in sync with one another, as if they had become one with the land. They knew the hills, the rivers, the valleys. They knew how to fight, how to survive, how to endure. The ridge came into view as they rounded the final bend, the dark silhouette of the land stark against the pale sky. The settlers had made their camp on the far side, the firelight flickering in the distance, a beacon of their presence. Wicasa stopped his horse at the crest of the ridge, his eyes scanning the scene below. The warriors gathered around him, their faces serious, their weapons ready. Ellie could feel the tension building, the anticipation thick in the air. "We will strike at first light," Wicasa said, his voice calm. But there was a sense of finality in it. "We will take what is ours and make sure they know that this land will never belong to them." Ellie could see the determination in his eyes, the fire that burned within him. He wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for his people, for their future, for everything they had built. But as she watched him, Ellie couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the fighting was done. What would the land look like when it was over? What would be left? She didn't know the answers. She didn't even know if she had the right to ask. But she did know this: she wasn't alone anymore. And for better or worse, She had chosen this life. The night passed slowly, the silence heavy in the air. Ellie lay awake in her tent, staring up at the canvas roof, her thoughts swirling. The sound of horses moving outside, the distant crackle of fire, the low murmurs of the warriors preparing, all of it filled her mind with a strange sense of purpose. She wasn't ready for this. No one ever was. But she had come to understand that sometimes it wasn't about being ready. It was about standing. Standing for what you believed in, for the people who depended on you. The sun would rise soon, and the battle would begin. She could hear the distant calls of the birds, the soft rustle of the trees in the wind. The land was waking up, preparing for what was to come. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. There was no more running, no more hiding. She would fight, and when it was over, whatever the outcome, she would stand. The first light of dawn broke across the ridge, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. The air was crisp and filled with anticipation. The land seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the inevitable. Ellie stood at the crest of the Yadsil ridge, her eyes fixed on the settlers' camp below. The sight of it, so peaceful, so unaware of the storm that was about to hit them, made her heart pound in her chest. She could hear the distant murmurs of the warriors behind her, their preparations, almost silent in their precision. Wicasa was already mounted, his horse standing tall beside him, his gaze locked on the camp. He didn't need to speak to the warriors. They were ready. Ellie could feel the energy building in the air, the tension, the determination, the understanding that this battle would define everything that came after. The time had come. The first light of dawn broke across the ridge, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. The air was crisp and filled with anticipation. The land seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the inevitable. Ellie stood at the crest of the Yadsil ridge, her eyes fixed on the settlers' camp below. The sight of it, so peaceful, so unaware of the storm that was about to hit them, made her heart pound in her chest. She could hear the distant murmurs of the warriors behind her, their preparations, almost silent in their precision. Wicasa was already mounted, his horse standing tall beside him, his gaze locked on the camp. He didn't need to speak to the warriors. They were ready. Ellie could feel the energy building in the air, the tension, the determination, the understanding that this battle would define everything that came after. The time had come. Wicasa turned to her, his expression stoic but filled with something deeper, something Ellie had come to recognize as respect. "Stay hidden," he said quietly. "The children must be kept out of harm's way. You must protect them." Ellie nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She hadn't come this far, hadn't fought beside the Lakota, only to be left behind now. But she understood. The women and children had to be safe. The warriors would fight. And Ellie. Ellie would stay with them, her place as their protector. Wicasa's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer. He didn't need to say anything else. She had already chosen. She was already part of this fight, part of them. The warriors moved like shadows, blending into the landscape as they descended toward the settlers' camp. Their footsteps were silent, their bodies poised, their weapons ready. Ellie watched them go, her chest tightening. She had seen warriors before, but never like this. The Lakota moved with a grace and power that seemed to merge with the very earth beneath them. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. They had a purpose. They had a right to protect what was theirs. Ellie stayed back, her position hidden, her rifle in hand. The women and children were gathered around her, the younger ones looking up at her with wide, frightened eyes. She tried to offer them reassurance with a steady smile, but her own nerves were frayed. She had never been a part of something so monumental. She had never faced such danger, but she wasn't afraid, not anymore. The fear she had felt in the beginning, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what was coming, had faded. It had been replaced by something stronger. The determination, She couldn't let the settlers take this land. She couldn't let them erase everything the Lakota had built, everything they had fought for. The sounds of the battle reached her soon enough. The crack of gunfire, the roar of men, the clash of steel against steel. Ellie's heart pounded as the air around her seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the conflict below. The warriors were relentless, each one fighting with the same intensity, the same will to protect. The women around Ellie watched in silence, their faces taut with fear but also with understanding. This was their fight too. They didn't need to be on the front lines to be part of it. They had always been part of it. Their strength was in the quiet moments, in the care they gave to their children, in the way they held the community together when the world outside seemed to be falling apart. Ellie felt a surge of gratitude toward them. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive. She was part of something, part of a community, a family, and that meant standing no matter what. The sounds of the battle grew louder, and Ellie's grip on her rifle tightened. She didn't know how much longer she could stand there, watching. She wanted to be part of it. She wanted to fight. But for now, her place was here. She had to protect the women and children. She had to stand guard. Hours passed, though they felt like days. The battle raged on below, the sounds of it echoing through the hills. Ellie's thoughts kept returning to the warriors. Wicasa, the young men, the elders. They were all risking their lives to protect this land. They were fighting for everything. They had. And Ellie couldn't help but wonder how much longer it would take before the settlers understood that they couldn't just take what didn't belong to them. The sky darkened as the battle finally drew to a close. The sounds of fighting slowly subsided, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. Ellie stayed in her position, her eyes scanning the horizon, her mind still racing. Wicasa appeared first, his figure emerging from the smoke and dust, his face unreadable. He was covered in dirt, his clothes torn, but he was alive. His eyes met Ellie's, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The battle had been won. The other warriors began to emerge, their faces grim, but resolute. They had fought hard, but the settlers had been driven off. The land was theirs, for now. Wicasa approached Ellie, his presence solid and reassuring. "It is over," he said, his voice low, filled with something that sounded like relief, but also something more. Ellie nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest. For the land was still, but it felt different now. It was no longer just a place to survive. It had become a battlefield, a place where the Lakota fought to protect their way of life, where every inch of earth beneath their feet was sacred. Ellie felt it in the air, a shift that had come with the battle. More, the victory, though hard won, had changed things. The settlers who had attacked were gone, but their presence lingered like a dark cloud, a reminder of how fragile their peace really was. The warriors had fought valiantly, but Ellie knew this wasn't the end. There would be more attacks, more battles. For now, the Lakota had held their ground. Ellie stood on the ridge once more, gazing out at the horizon. The smoke from the battle had cleared, but the weight of it all was still heavy on her chest. She had fought in her own way, by protecting the women and children, by standing with them, by not turning away when the world seemed to crumble. But was it enough? She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure she ever would. Wicasa appeared. Beside her, his footsteps soft against the earth, his presence as solid as ever. His eyes were steady, though there was something in his expression, something Ellie hadn't seen before. A kind of quiet sadness, perhaps, or the weight of knowing that the fight was far from over. "We have won today," he said, his voice low, almost contemplative, "but the war is far from over." Ellie nodded, her eyes still on the distant land. "I know." Wicasa's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke again. "You have proven yourself, Ellie. More than I expected. More than I thought." "Possible?" She turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what needed to be done." He smiled faintly, the first time she had seen any softness in him since the battle. "That is exactly what makes you strong. You do what needs to be done without hesitation. That is the heart of a warrior." Ellie's heart fluttered at his words. She wasn't a warrior, not in the way he meant, but she understood what he was saying. She had found her strength in standing, in facing the fear and the uncertainty, and doing what needed to be done. That was all she could do. That was all anyone could do. "We will move again," Wicasa continued, his voice steady, "to the south. The settlers will come for us, and we must be ready. But you are with us now. You are part of this, part of the Lakota." Ellie didn't speak at first. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had never asked to be part of something like this. She had come to the Black Hills to escape, to find a life of her own, free from the past. But now there was no escaping. The fight was her fight now. The Lakota were her family. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready." Wicasa nodded, his eyes filled with something that Ellie couldn't quite place. Perhaps respect, perhaps something deeper. "The Lakota will always fight for what is theirs," he said, his voice firm. "And you, Ellie, will always be one of us." Ellie felt the weight of his words settle into her chest. She was part of this, part of the land, part of the fight, part of the family. She couldn't change what had happened, couldn't undo the choices she had made, but she could stand, she could fight. And for the first time in a long while she felt something stirring inside her, a quiet strength, a fire that had been smoldering deep within her, waiting for the right moment to rise. It was time for her to stop running. Time for her to fight for everything she had come to care for. Time for her to find her place, once and for all. The wind began to pick up, rustling the trees around them, carrying with it the scent of the land, of the earth. It felt like a sign, like the land itself was calling to her, urging her forward. There was no turning back now. Wicasa placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch strong and sure. "We leave at first light. Be ready." Ellie nodded, her heart steady, as she looked out at the land before her. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. As the day wore on, the warriors began their preparations for the journey south. Ellie moved through the camp, helping where she could, feeling the weight of each movement, each decision. The women were just as prepared as the men, their faces set in determination. They had already seen what could happen if they weren't ready. They wouldn't be caught off guard again. That night, as the stars shone overhead and the fire crackled in the center of the camp, Ellie sat alone by the fire, her thoughts racing. The quiet moments were always the hardest, when there was nothing left to do but think. She thought of the battle, of the settlers, of the future. She thought of the Lakota, the people she had come to respect, to love, to stand beside. And then she thought of the boy, Wicasa Jr. He had seen the world in a way she couldn't imagine. He had been raised in the midst of this fight, in a world of survival. He was growing up to be a warrior, and Ellie had helped him survive. She had saved his life. That thought lingered in her mind as she stared into the flames. "I'm ready," she whispered to herself. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." The fire flickered, its warmth surrounding her, and for the first time Ellie felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a peace that came from the absence of conflict. It wasn't a peace that came from knowing everything would be okay. It was a peace that came from standing firm, from knowing that whatever came next, she would face it, she would fight. And for the first time in a long while, Ellie felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The night before they departed, the wind shifted again. This time it was warmer, carrying with it the scent of rain, a reminder that seasons would continue to change, whether or not the world around them did. Ellie stood outside her tent, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her gaze cast toward the horizon where the last traces of daylight faded into the blue-gray of twilight. The battle was over, but the war, as Wicasa had warned, was far from done. The next few days would be a test. They were heading south into a territory where the settlers had begun to gather in greater numbers. Wicasa had spoken of moving quietly, of watching, of being ready for the inevitable push. They had no illusions about the settlers' intentions. They would come again, and when they did, the Lakota would be ready. Ellie had been part of the tribe's strength since the battle, and now as they prepared to move once again, she felt the weight of her place among them more deeply than ever before. She wasn't just a woman surviving in the West. She was part of something larger, something that reached back into the history of the land, a history that would continue long after the settlers had left their mark. She heard the soft sounds of horses moving behind her, the soft thud of hooves on the ground, the low murmurs of the warriors making their final preparations. Wicasa was in the center of it all, his voice carrying above the others as he gave orders, spoke with the elders, ensured that everything was in place. Ellie wasn't needed for the war council. She had no say in the strategy of the warriors, and she was okay with that. Her place was with the women and children, but tonight she found herself restless. The familiar feeling of uncertainty gnawed at her, the same feeling that had accompanied every difficult choice she had made since arriving in the Black Hills. Would the Lakota ever see her as truly one of their own? Or would she always be an outsider? She thought of Wicasa, of the way he had stood by her through everything, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. He had made her feel part of something. He had made her feel like she had a place. "You're lost in thought again," came the voice of the woman who had smiled at her the night of the battle. Ellie turned to face her, the familiar warmth in her eyes offering a sense of comfort. "I suppose I am," Ellie replied with a small smile. "I don't know how to stop it," the woman chuckled softly. "You don't have to stop it. You just have to keep moving forward, that's all. The land will guide you." Ellie wasn't sure if she believed that. She had never been the type to believe in signs, in the idea that the land or the earth could tell her what to do. But as she watched the woman move through the camp with quiet grace, leading the children toward the fire, she couldn't help but think that perhaps there was something in it, something in the way the Lakota had lived for generations. Maybe. The land did have a way of guiding them. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stay in this world. The pull of the past still lingered. The memory of her old life, of the man she had left behind, still haunted her in moments of quiet. But the Black Hills had a hold on her now, just as the Lakota had a hold on her heart. She couldn't leave. Not now, not after everything she had seen, everything she had fought for. "Do you ever wonder what the future will be like?" Ellie asked, her voice low as she watched the woman's movements. The woman paused, turning back to her with a knowing smile. "Of course, but we do not live in the future. We live in the present, and the present is enough." Ellie thought about that for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. She had been so focused on what would come, on the battles and the decisions that lay ahead, that she hadn't stopped to consider the strength of the present. She had survived this far. She had made it through the fight, and maybe that was enough. As the warriors mounted their horses and the women and children gathered their belongings, Ellie felt the finality of the moment settle over her. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time she didn't feel alone. She wasn't just a woman caught in the crossfire of two worlds. She was part of something that went beyond herself. She was part of the Lakota. Wicasa approached her then, his face calm, his eyes sharp. There was no fanfare as he stopped in front of her, his gaze steady. "It is time," he said simply. Ellie nodded, a small but determined smile tugging at her lips. "I'm ready." Wicasa studied her for a moment, as though searching for something in her eyes, something that told him whether she was truly ready for what lay ahead. Finally he gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. But there was a flicker of something, perhaps pride, beneath it. "You have come far," he said. "Farther than I expected." She looked up at him, the words from earlier echoing in her mind. "You do what needs to be done without hesitation." "Then let's go," she said, her voice steady. "We've got a future to fight for." With that, Wicasa turned, leading his horse toward the rest of the warriors. Ellie followed close behind, her heart calm, her mind clear. The land stretched out before her, vast and uncertain. But for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. They were leaving for the south, to face whatever came next. The settlers wouldn't stop trying to take what wasn't theirs, but the Lakota wouldn't stop fighting, and Ellie would fight with them. As they moved forward, the wind carrying the dust of their journey, she realized that the present, the only thing that truly mattered, was right here, right now. And this was where she belonged, where she had chosen to stand, and, with that, she rode alongside them, ready for whatever came next. The days blurred together as they traveled south, the land unfolding before them in endless waves of green and gold, the vastness of it overwhelming and awe-inspiring. The Lakota warriors moved with the precision of those who knew the land like the back of their hands. They had no need for maps or signs. The land was their map, and they read it with the ease of a language they had spoken for generations. Ellie rode alongside them, her eyes scanning the horizon, her senses heightened. Every rustle of the wind, every movement in the trees, every distant cry in the air. She felt it all, a quiet connection to the land she hadn't understood until now. The West was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, a force of nature that demanded respect. And yet, despite the beauty of the land, Ellie couldn't shake the unease that had taken root deep within her. The settlers were still out there. Somewhere, the battles they had fought so far had been necessary, but they were just the beginning. The Lakota were prepared, but so too were the settlers, and as much as she had come to admire the warriors' strength and unity, Ellie couldn't escape the truth. There was a storm brewing, and it would not pass quietly. It was mid-afternoon when they reached a ridge that overlooked a wide valley, the trees giving way to open fields. From the ridge, Ellie could see the smoke rising in the distance, a faint but unmistakable sign of movement below. The warriors, already alert, began to spread out, their movements synchronized, their eyes sharp. Wicasa signaled for the group to stop. Ellie dismounted with the rest of the women and children, her eyes scanning the valley below. There was no immediate threat, but the smoke was a clear indication that something was coming. The settlers were gathering, preparing for another push. "They are close," Wicasa said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "We cannot wait any longer. We must take a stand." Ellie felt her chest tighten at the words. She had known. This moment was coming, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon. They had been traveling for days, moving steadily toward the south, hoping for a reprieve, but the fight was never far from their minds. "What should we do?" Ellie asked, her voice steady. Though her pulse quickened, Wicasa's eyes were dark, his expression unreadable. "We wait for the night. The cover of darkness will give us an advantage. We strike before they know what's happening." Ellie nodded, her mind racing. She had never been in the midst of such a calculated move. She had been part of the survival, the watching, the waiting, the protecting, but she had never been part of the strategy. The battle would unfold tonight, and Ellie knew she had to be ready. As the hours passed, the air grew thick with anticipation. The warriors were quiet, their eyes scanning the land, their horses restless beneath them. The women and children gathered close, their voices low, their faces set with a quiet determination. Ellie moved among them, offering whatever comfort she could, her thoughts heavy with what lay ahead. This wasn't just another battle. This was a fight for the future, for the land, for the people, for the life they had built. She could feel it deep in her bones. This was the reckoning. Nightfall arrived with a heavy silence. The the stars twinkling above them, the air cool and crisp. The warriors, cloaked in shadows, began to move, their footsteps light on the earth. Wicasa gave the signal, and the rest of the warriors followed, moving swiftly and quietly down the ridge toward the valley. Ellie stayed behind with the women and children, her heart heavy, as she watched the silhouettes of the warriors disappear into the darkness. She wasn't meant to fight in the front lines, but she wasn't just standing by. She was part of this. She had to be. The hours seemed to stretch on forever, the quiet of the night oppressive, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Ellie stood at the edge of the camp, her senses heightened, every muscle in her body tense. The sounds of the battle below, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the roar of animals were muted, but they still reached her ears, each one a reminder of what was at stake. Wicasa appeared again, his figure emerging from the shadows like a ghost. His face was grim, but there was a fire in his eyes that Ellie hadn't seen before. This was the moment that defined them, the moment when the world changed. "It is done," Wicasa said simply, his voice low but filled with a sense of finality. "The settlers have been pushed back, but this is not the end. We will not stop until they understand that this land is ours." Ellie nodded, though her thoughts were a whirl of confusion. The battle was won for now, but there was no illusion of peace. There would be more battles, more threats. The fight was far from over. As Wicasa and the warriors began to regroup, Ellie stood at the edge of the ridge, her eyes scanning the valley below. The smoke from the settlers' camp still lingered, but the signs of life had been extinguished. The land was quiet again, but Ellie knew that it wouldn't last. She had fought beside the Lakota, but she had also learned from them. She had learned that strength didn't come from violence alone. It came from unity, from standing together when everything else seemed to fall apart, but strength was not enough. They needed more than that. They needed peace. They needed a future that wasn't defined by conflict, by endless struggle. And Ellie wondered, as she looked out at the land that had become her home, if that future was even possible. Wicasa appeared beside her, his presence solid and sure. He didn't speak at first, but Ellie knew he was waiting for something, waiting for her to say something, anything. "Do you think it will ever end?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Wicasa's gaze softened, and for the first time she saw something in him, a flicker of the weariness he had been hiding all along. "It will end when we make it end," he said simply, "when we decide that we will no longer fight to survive. We will fight to live," Ellie thought. About his words, letting them settle in her mind. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for something more, something that had been lost, something they had to reclaim. "I will stand with you," she said quietly, her voice steady, "for as long as it takes." Wicasa nodded, a small smile pulling at the corner of his lips. "Then we will stand together." As they turned and walked back toward the camp, Ellie felt the weight of the future settle around her like a cloak. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing: she was part of this fight. She was part of this family. And that was enough. The days after the battle were filled with a quiet intensity. The warriors who had fought so fiercely now rested, their faces solemn as they tended to the wounded, their bodies weary from the strain. The women and children, too, seemed to move, more slowly, the weight of the past few days heavy on their shoulders. Yet, despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of pride in the air. They had held their ground. They had fought for their land, for their people, and they had won. For now, Ellie found herself back in the rhythm of camp life. She helped where she could, caring for the wounded, gathering supplies, tending to the children. But there was a quiet unrest that had settled deep within her, a sense of uncertainty that she couldn't shake. The battle had been hard, but it was just one in a long line of battles that were sure to come. The settlers would not relent. They would always try to take more, to push the Lakota off the land that was rightfully theirs. She had always been a woman who looked forward, who focused on what needed to be done. But now, with everything she had fought for weighing on her, Ellie found herself looking back, questioning everything that had led her to this point. She had chosen this life. She had chosen to stand with the Lakota. But did that choice mean she was part of their world, or just an outsider who had found herself caught in the crossfire of something much larger than herself? Wakasa's words echoed in her mind. We will fight to live. But could they? Could the Lakota ever truly find peace, or would they always be fighting, always defending what was theirs? That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy silence, Ellie found herself once again by the fire, staring into the flames. The night was cool, the sky clear and full of stars, and for a moment the weight of the world seemed to fall away. It was in these quiet moments that she felt closest to the land that had taken her in, that had become a part of her. It wasn't her land, but it was hers in a way. She had fought for it alongside the Lakota, and in doing so, she had become a part of something much larger than herself. She wasn't just a settler anymore. She wasn't just a woman trying to escape her past. She was part of the fight, and that made all the difference. Wakasa appeared beside her, his presence steady and solid as always. He stood for a moment in silence before speaking, his voice low, almost gentle. "It is not over," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire. "But there is peace in this moment. We must take it where we can." Ellie looked up at him, her heart heavy with unasked questions. "How long can we live like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long can we fight before it takes everything from us?" Wakasa met her gaze, his eyes steady, the weight of years of struggle reflected in them. "We fight because we have no other choice. We fight because this land, this life, is ours, and we will not let anyone take it from us. But the fight will take much. It will take our strength, our families, our futures. But we will stand, Ellie. We will stand." Ellie nodded slowly, though a part of her wondered how much longer they could keep standing. How many more battles would they have to fight before the land was truly theirs? How many more lives would be lost in the struggle? Wikasa's eyes softened, his expression unreadable, but filled with something deeper, something that Ellie couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the understanding that came from living a life of constant struggle. Perhaps it was the acceptance that peace was not a guarantee, but something that could only be earned through strength, through sacrifice. "We do not fight just to survive," he said, his voice low and firm. "We fight for something greater, for our children, for the future." Ellie swallowed, her throat tight with the weight of his words. "And what about us? What about now?" Wikasa's gaze softened slightly. "We fight for the present as well. For the moment when we can look at what we have and know that we did not let it slip away, that we fought for it." Ellie looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above them, so vast and so far away. There was so much she didn't understand about this life, about the Lakota, about the land. But in that moment, as she sat by the fire with Wakasa, surrounded by the warriors and the women who had become her family, she knew one thing for sure. This was her fight. It had always been her fight, even before she had known it. The land had called to her, the Lakota had called to her, and in answering that call, she had found a purpose that was more than just survival. She had found something to live for. She turned to Wakasa, meeting his gaze with a quiet resolve. "Then we fight. Together." Wakasa's lips curved slightly, the ghost of a smile tugging at his features. Together. As the fire crackled in the stillness of the night, Ellie sat, in silence, her heart steady. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know how many battles were left to fight. But she knew one thing: she would stand. And when the day came that the land was truly theirs, when peace was more than just a distant dream, she would be there, standing with the Lakota, knowing that she had fought for it. For now, though, the night was still, and the future could wait. The dawn was breaking, casting long golden streaks across the land, as if the earth itself were stretching awake after a long, restless night. The air was still, cool, but growing warmer with the first rays of the sun. The camp had already begun to stir, the sound of horses shifting in the morning light, the soft murmur of voices rising as the warriors prepared for the day ahead. For the first time in a long while, Ellie stood at the edge of the camp, the weight of the journey, the weight of everything that had come before, pressing on her shoulders. The land stretched before her, vast and wild, the valley rolling away in every direction. It was beautiful, in its own untamed way, and it was hers now, too. Not because she had claimed it, but because she had chosen to be part of it. She had fought for it, with the Lakota, with the land, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Wicasa appeared beside her, his figure solid against the morning light. He didn't speak right away, but stood next to her, his gaze fixed on the horizon, just as hers was. There was something quiet about him today, something reflective, as if the weight of everything that had happened was finally settling into his bones. "We have come a long way," he said, his voice low, yet steady. "Longer than I thought we would." Ellie glanced at him, noting the depth of weariness in his face, the subtle shift in his expression. He had led them through so much, through battles, losses, and the struggles of survival. And yet, here he stood, still standing, still guiding them, still fighting. "We've all come a long way," she replied, her voice softer than she had intended, her words filled with meaning that she hadn't known how to say until now. She glanced around the camp, the warriors gathering their gear, the women tending to the children, the land spread out before them, waiting. "But it's not over, is it?" Wicasa met her gaze then, his eyes steady, but there was something in them, something that told Ellie he had already known the answer to her question. "No," he said simply, "it is never over." Ellie's chest tightened at his words, but it was not with fear. It was with something deeper, something like resolve. The battle, the fight, the struggle for this land, for their way of life, it would never end. There would always be threats, always someone trying to take what was theirs. The Lakota had always known that. It had always been part of their story, part of their survival, but now it was her story too. "We fight not just to survive," Wicasa continued, his voice softer now, almost reflective, "but to live, to protect what we hold dear." Ellie nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. She had heard them before. She had been part of them, had stood beside the Lakota in their fight. But now, standing there with him, she understood them in a way she hadn't before. This wasn't just about protecting land. This wasn't just about fighting for survival. It was about living. It was about standing firm in the face of everything that tried to tear you down. It was about making a life in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. And that was something Ellie had learned. She had learned it in the quiet moments by the fire, in the chaos of battle, in the faces of the people who had fought beside her. She had learned it in the way the Lakota stood together, in the way they had each other's backs, in the way they fought for what was rightfully theirs. And now she fought for it too. As the warriors began to move, readying themselves for the journey ahead, Wicasa gave Ellie a final glance. There was something in his eyes, something deeper than gratitude, something that felt almost like acknowledgement. "You are part of this," he said, his voice steady but filled with meaning. "You always have been." Ellie's heart swelled at his words. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She wasn't just someone who had come here looking for a place to hide. She was part of this world, part of this fight, part of this land. And no matter what came next, she would stand, she would fight. The sun rose higher in the sky, and with it, the world seemed to breathe a little easier. The future was still uncertain. There would always be more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long while, Ellie felt a quiet peace settle within her. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for it. With one last glance at the land, Ellie mounted her horse, her heart steady as she turned her gaze forward. The Lakota were already moving, already preparing for the journey ahead. The road would be long and the challenges would come. But she knew one thing for certain. She was not alone, and together they would stand. Together they would fight, and that, more than anything, was enough.